All right. Well, it's been a while since we've had quite this kind of this caliber of guest on Badger Beer Hour, because we have not a president but a double president. We've got Will Glass here today. He is the president of the Wisconsin Brewers Guild, which is why we wanted. Oh, look at him! He thinks that was a good one, huh? Will?
I wasn't sure who you were talking about. We were kind of proud of that.
We've got he's so president of the Wisconsin Brewers Guild, which is I guess a trade organization for independent Wisconsin breweries, and he's also president and founder of the Brewing Projekt in Eau Claire. Will, welcome to the Badger Beer Hour.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Sorry it took so long to get here.
Oh, no problem, no problem. So I asked you to, I wanted to have you on because you were representing the state's brewers during negotiations for what became, I believe it's called, are they calling it Act 268? Is that like the nomenclature for it?
I'll be honest, after we counted noses in the Senate and they got a final vote, I tuned out. It passed.
All right. So this law that
crying, and then I was
this law that was passed last, I think Evers signed it last in early December, and it was. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think this is basically the biggest overhaul of Wisconsin's laws regulating alcohol that we've seen in like a generation. Is that fair to say?
Since the repeal of Prohibition, really. I
mean, okay, multiple generations then.
Yeah, it's man. I mean, this is the kind of thing I could talk for hours and hours and hours about, and regretfully, unfortunately, have. But yeah, I mean, there really hasn't been a good thing that has happened for the beer industry since the repeal of Prohibition. Our businesses have only lost rights and only lost abilities really since then. And this was a pretty big step towards making a much, I'll say, more equitable system for I think all of the tiers. I really hate that phrase, but
right.
That's what they call it.
So can you kind of, I mean, like this was a big one. So what were kind of the biggest changes for brewers in this law?
Oh man, well, I think that's a matter of context, honestly, because there are so many different things that happened in this bill that allowed people to even own a business. Goes back to like my story, but it allows people to grow a business. It allows people to bring back business that they didn't used to have. It clarifies things. So depending on what type of a brewery you are or what type of business model you have, it is such a, I mean, it does so much. It really does. It's far from perfect. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that I kind of had to get over, was this idea that, perfection is the enemy of good, and we were never going to get to perfect. I worked on this for almost 8 years in total. And after, I think, the 4th year, I started thinking, yeah, we're either not going to get anything ever, or we're going to have to make some compromises. And that's where we ended up. But I mean, some of the big highlights are the restoration of what will basically be like full service bar in a lot of breweries, codifying existing trade practice that has been deemed illegal just in the last year or so. Things that are threatening to shut down small businesses and big businesses. Interest restrictions, the ability for a brewer to rent a brewery space from a landlord who maybe owns a grocery store, which was a common one that I heard a lot of, especially in central Wisconsin.
Okay.
It's just there's so much in here, and there's a lot to it, but it's pretty awesome.
So, full disclosure or not full, just kind of looping the audience into what we already know, is I actually reached out to you earlier this year to kind of come on and talk about how the implementation of this law is going, but it's not quite that simple, right? Like what's happening with this right now, and let's go there first. How is this kind of, is it in force now?
No, it's not.
Okay.
I mean, one of the biggest things that needed to happen was what is now the creation of the the Division of Alcohol Enforcement for the state of Wisconsin. So it's going to be a new subset of the Wisconsin not Department of Revenue. Yeah, Department of Revenue. Gosh, in my mind, I was saying Department of Natural Resources, and Revenue came out. I guess 2 beers in, that's what's just going to happen.
So
But
measure beer our way.
yeah, right. So they have to basically create that agency, and then they have to create the rules that that agency is going to operate by. And this was one of the very enlightening things over the years that I learned by working through our attorneys and working with legislators, working with people inside the Dome in Madison, was this idea that you can't make a law that covers every instance that's ever going to come up. There's going to be rulemaking, there's going to be ambiguity, there's going to be subjectivity. But first step is that they have to actually create that office, and then they have to appoint somebody to run it. And last I heard, that person still doesn't exist. And we're a month and a half ish away from most of this taking effect. And, that's just kind of how bureaucracy works, I guess. It's a process that's going to take Senate confirmation for the head of this thing. And there isn't a name yet. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the Senate's like done with, they're like peace outed. So I mean, does that mean that the bureaucratic portion of it can go without the politically approved head, or?
Yeah, and they can appoint an interim, and there is somebody who's kind of starting that transitionary role right now. There was a technicality type meeting for promulgation about a month ago, and it was like, man, is this what government does when we're not looking? It was a bunch of people sitting on a Zoom meeting waiting for somebody to talk, and it was over in like 20 minutes. There was literally no word said for about 10 minutes. It was really weird.
Wow.
Yeah, as of right now, I know that there's a bit of angst because a lot of municipalities are kind of in limbo. The way that the laws have been in Wisconsin for so long have been very difficult to read. And if you talk to any municipality, they'll say that sometimes they're getting different answers depending on who they talk to, if they call Madison or if they talk to their local enforcement guy. And to be very honest, it's not really their fault because the laws were so hard to read. You could get two very reasonable and very intelligent people to read the same, chunk of statute and come out of it with 2 and 3 and 4 different opinions. So a few years ago, I was a member of a legislative study committee, and I sat next to the man who was the attorney for the municipal attorneys for the state of Wisconsin. And it was really interesting to hear his take on this. And all he wanted was consistency. But when you look at statute, there isn't any. Or we should say, when we looked at the previous statute, there was a whole lot less. So yeah, there's going to have to be rules made. There are going to have to be forms made. Municipalities are going to have to be educated. Breweries, wineries, distilleries, wholesalers, retailers are all going to have to be, get some re-education during this process as well. But I expect it's just like anything else. Implementation and change is hard. So it's going to be challenging. I'll say that our work is not done yet, especially as Wisconsin Brewers Guild, to make sure that the promulgation process follows really what the intent of the statutes were. But it's exciting. Honestly, I think that one of the you were talking about at the beginning of the news about these places that are opening up additional retail locations. These changes were some of the changes that are going to help facilitate a lot more of that type of growth. And some of these guys, I'll say I know about these upcoming law changes and what's going to come to them as a result. So it's going to make a lot of these new, tap room split offs much more feasible, or not feasible necessarily, but financially feasible, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I mean, like some of it is just certainty that they're not going to be able to lose, that they wouldn't open that and then lose it, right? Like because of the way the existing law was read, or the previous law, I guess, was read.
And I guess that in addition to the other 2 presidencies, I'm also the president of the Wisconsin Craft Beverage Coalition. So I get to represent the wineries and distilleries in this as well.
Right.
And there was such crazy shit happening, like Wollersheim literally being told they had to close down a location that they had operated for decades out of the blue. Distilleries being told, hey, you've got that location there. Well, this one's illegal. you granted us that permit 10 years ago. It's that kind of
Right.
crazy stuff that,
Right.
like, how are you supposed to operate a business or even expand a business if you think they can do it, you can do it, right? They'll
Yeah.
send
Right.
so where the interpretation. So, there's going to be a lot that comes to this, and to your point, clarity is a huge, huge one. Yes, there were things that we were able to kind of operate almost in the gray of ambiguity that were very beneficial. But any reasonable person could very clearly read some of those statutes and say that's definitely not what that means. And
What? Give me an example of one of
I'll
those
give you a
things.
really good example. Yeah. The big one is this idea of the current offsite retail location. So the way that that's been utilized, and I'll say especially down in your corner of the state now,
Hmm.
or not now, over the last handful of years, that was 100% not the intent of what that law was supposed to be. The intent of that law goes that was sort of a contract brand that they had split off, and that contract brand wanted to have a second retail location, and they got a brewer's permit to be able to do that. Well, when the laws changed, I think it was 2008 when they started limiting what a brew pub and a brewery could be, and then they created the whole concept of a recipe brewer's permit. They were going to have to close down that offsite retail location, so they granted that offsite retail location to any production facility. If you actually read the statute verbatim, it quite literally says or, and it was interpreted as and or, meaning that you would have two locations as opposed to only one. So it was a very generous interpretation that has been taken advantage of.
And that's
And
that's what that's I mean, those licenses are what we're talking about with with venture, with even like with the beer gardens that like that's a big one down here is a brewery opening up or having a beer garden in a county park or something like that.
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that stuff, I mean, again, like any absolutely reasonable person can read that the way that that statute was written. And if you had a yes or no, does this say that it allows two locations? The answer is no.
Okay.
But somewhere along the line, that interpretation that was created basically for that sort of quasi contract recipe brewer's permit became that second retail location. And as it continued to kind of proliferate through the market, it turned into this thing. Well, now we would have to tell like 20 or 30 businesses that they're going to have to close their secondary location. And DOR kind of took this like, yeah, let's just stick with that interpretation. But it's the kind of thing where, again, going back to the Wollersheim being told to
I
close a
mean,
second location, like if they can decide that, like this on a whim with a business that's been operating for decades and has a name like that, who's to say that that wasn't going to happen?
all it
And
would
I'll
take
say
would be a lawsuit, right? Probably.
not
Like
not even just
having a judge look at that statute and say,
it would take the head of the current Department of Enforcement to just say, yeah, I don't like that anymore, and then it's
yikes.
done. I mean, that's because that's basically what happened.
Right.
I'm
So,
sorry,
okay,
my dog is
so
jumping on my laptop here. I gotta
that's
buddy,
all
go.
right.
Sorry,
Well, it's better
he's
than the kids, I
120
guess.
pounds, so yeah. Here, I'll get his big dumb face over here.
Oh, what a good boy.
Yeah. There, he's
Okay,
got his toy
so
though.
one of the kind of the functions that you have as Brewers Guild president, I imagine, especially in times like these, is people are coming and you're given your involvement in shaping this law. I imagine you're hearing tons of questions from your constituents, brewers, and like as you mentioned, the entire craft was it craft producers
Craft Beverage Coalition.
beverage
Yeah.
coalition.
So
Okay, so
that
you
that
got
entity is the Wineries Association, the Distillers Guild, and the Brewers Guild.
okay, so I mean, I imagine that you have all these businesses asking you like, hey, what is this going to look like? What are you hearing from the producers about how what they're thinking about might pertain to them with this law? Like kind of look forward a little bit. Like what is the stuff that you're hearing the most often?
The There are two things that I hear the most. One of them I'm not surprised about. The other one I'm sort of surprised is as big of a deal that it's been. The I'll say that the one that surprised me was the number of brewers looking for storage space or looking to move locations that aren't able to get a warehouse or aren't able to get a secondary retail location potentially because that landlord has a financial interest in another area in the industry.
Mm,
That was one that I had heard about prior to this law, and it was mostly having to do with storage. It was like, okay, the grocery store, the guy that owns the grocery store owns the mini storage, and then when you try to license that as your secondary or as a beer warehouse, the Department of Revenue would say, no, you can't do that because, well, that landlord might have an impact over your business decisions because you're both in the alcohol industry. Like that's how ridiculous it was. But now that as long as those relationships are disclosed, they're going to be allowed. And I will say that that leads into the second one, or the biggest one that I hear about is that additional retail locations. The industry has changed a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think that a lot of brewers are looking at where their business is in general and thinking, how do I sell as much product as possible over my bar? And one of the easiest ways to do that is through that secondary location. So
mm,
now they have the ability to go and maybe, how many closed down convenience stores are there around, even gas stations? Like there are guys who are looking at opening up their secondary locations that have a big beer garden that used to be out, on the where a gas pad was. Like they have the ability to lease those locations, and now they have the ability to go and operate these offsite retail locations, and have the or be eligible to do wine and spirits in those locations as well. So if
right.
if what we're seeing is our members trying to get product to market, we could have either done direct to consumer, which is direct ship. And I'll tell you that the appetite for that was nil across the state. The only people interested in it were small breweries. Every other interest group was going to say no. So then it turned into, okay, well, how do we get ourselves back to a position that we were pre 2011, where we had the ability to open additional retail locations, where we had the ability to access more consumers, and not only access more consumers, but entice more to come in our front door. There's that kind of saying for tap rooms where you get a group of 6 people in, and 5 of them want to drink the beer that you make in the building. One of them wants a Busch Light, and 2 of them want wine. As of today, you can't do 3 of
Hmm.
those people aren't going to be happy. So now our breweries are going to be able to cater to those events. A lot of breweries are, again, when you were talking about the news, like they're opening locations that are going to be able to facilitate special events, meetings, weddings, stuff like that. And now, grandma's going to be able to get a glass of wine. You're going to be eligible to have signature cocktails. If
Hmm.
Uncle Joe wants a freaking Jack and Coke, he can get a Jack and Coke if he wants. So it's going to allow our guys to really continue to promote that retail direct to consumer, where their margins are the highest, and where it's really going to help them survive. So
Oh, oh yeah.
fancy.
The peanut gallery is chiming in here. Um, well, Will, you kind of alluded to this, but we obviously some pretty somber news coming in the news segment coming into this interview.
Mhm.
It's tough out there right now. What are you hearing from um, specifically Brewers Guild members about that? Just kind of everything.
What I'm hearing is that it's a tough market, and that you know it's growth has become harder and harder. I think that if you look at distribution in general, there are a lot of out-of-state breweries coming in, and they're coming in because they're having to, there's that old thing where it's like you go an inch wide and a mile deep in distribution, or you go a mile wide and an inch deep. And a lot of breweries have already gone that inch deep and a mile wide, but they built themselves up for the capacity to go a mile wide and a mile deep. And now they're suddenly going, oh shit, we better start spreading this out. And shelf space is limited. There's only so much space in a store. And THC beverages, as THC beverages continue to come up, what are they going to be taking the shelf space of? You're not going to see Festival and Woodman's blowing out walls to put in a THC section. They're going to start taking it away from beer. Obviously, we hope that it's not independently brewed craft beer, but that's just kind of the reality of where we're at. Shelf space is getting tighter. RTDs, I've heard seltzers are going back down, but depending on where you're at, some of them are staying up. So it's a weird market. I hear a lot about diversification, again, THC beverages. It's interesting. It's a weird place to be, and I honestly I don't think it's going to get much more comfortable, especially for breweries that think distribution is the answer.
Hmm.
Um, I think that we're going to see a lot more focus on retail, and that's really I think how a lot of people are going to survive.
And I mean I mean that ties into what just happened with this law, right? I mean, like that's kind of the point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, like I said, I personally worked on that legislation hands on for damn near 8 years. I had been working for the 2 years prior to that kind of on my own. Um, but these things that we just got done are not things that I thought were going to be as beneficial then as they are, which I think is great. We kind of sat down, we did our first poll of members, figure out what are your legislative priorities, where is the low hanging fruit, what should we go after, how can we get a win. And we thought, like, 2 or 3 years we'll be able to get this done. And shit, was I wrong? Were we all wrong? Um, but that it was never really in our mind that this retail component was going to end up being as important, I think, as it's going to become.
Mm.
So it was a lot of work to get the things that we got, and I don't want to say that it's serendipitous because we all wish that we were in a better position as an industry, but it feels like things are getting tighter and tighter every day. All of our costs have gone up, that's for sure. And most people aren't real happy when they see their 4 pack or 6 pack go a couple bucks on the shelf. So a
Yeah.
lot of us, and I would say me included, we've held off on uh, price increases as much as possible, and that makes it harder to stay alive. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Well, let me ask you to take off. I don't know. Presidents don't have like crowns, but they have maybe the sash. Do they have
yeah,
sashes sometimes?
yeah,
Okay, can you take off the
yeah,
Brewers Guild sash
yeah.
and slip on the comfortable Brewing Projekt sash and tell us what's going on at the Brewing Projekt? What's happening in Eau Claire?
Oh man, what's happening at the Brewing Project? We're investing in retail. We built out our big building in 2019, only to have it basically shuttered for the first year.
Yeah.
But we're excited to be getting wine and spirits in. Honestly, we've been able to do wine and spirits for the last 2 years because we're also a winery and a distillery. Um, People don't know that, and we don't tell people that, but we are. And it's been really great. But we're going to continue to look at how do we get people in the door. How do we continue to continue to grow our kind of community engagement. I mean, we've got everything from teachers groups meeting on a weekly basis to plant markets and like all this other stuff. And how can we just take advantage of the assets that we have of this really cool location downtown Eau Claire on the river, especially when out anytime it's like a nice spring day and there's like 40 or 50 people out on the patio and t-shirts when it's even 40 degrees out, and it's classic Wisconsin spring, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, we really want to grow that. I used to be of the opinion that I wanted to be like a 10,000 barrel brewery, and we'll be there, but we're also doing it through contract production at this point. I had a couple of friends reach out over the last few years, and we've been making beer for them. And man, I'm not gonna lie, if we could make more beer of other people's, that'd be fine because then I don't have to worry about selling it. It's a lot less stressful. It's not dealing with wholesalers trying to shake down, IOUs and money owed. I know you were talking about Fair State right up front. I was dealing with a wholesaler in a state where they were also with that same wholesaler, and I had to take them or threaten a lawsuit over about $100,000 that was more than a year past due. And I know for a fact that they were in a similar boat and probably are in a similar boat still. So this is that thing where distribution across the country has just become tight, and a lot of wholesalers aren't up to terms, and it's making business tight across the board. So again, if I could go back to just like the Brewing Projekt hat and make a whole lot of beer for other people who would then have to deal with wholesalers, man, that'd be heaven.
Um, you kind of mentioned the retail aspect as one of the oh, am I getting cut off? Okay. We'll make this quick. I mean, it's been good, but okay. One quick question. You mentioned retail as being a really a pathway to success or stability, at least for in the industry right now. You were at the table at the negotiating table for a long time with members of that tier, specifically the Tavern League and the grocers, So, and I guess I'm thinking about the Tavern League here because they are probably most directly affected by these extra retail locations. I mean, in a lot of these, we've talked a lot about these kind of small, breweries in small towns that are really functioning as gathering places and points of community pride, functions that had kind of been, occupied by the corner bar, and in many ways they are similar to corner bars right now.
Mhm.
What's the like how what like what can you tell us about that dynamic and how, because they haven't really, Tavern League doesn't really say a whole lot about anything, but they haven't really said a whole lot about this bill either. So I'm kind of curious what you can say about any of that.
Oh, wow.
And I understand that negotiations are happening in private for a reason, and but I did want to ask a question because I think, you
Yeah.
know, yeah.
Um, I will say that, uh, what should I
Save the hardest
say?
question for last, Will.
Yeah, right. Um, I will say this, that I think that you're right about the gathering place component of our industry and where things have gone. It's a, despite being a very old industry, a newer industry. Um, but one of the things that we did, and I think that it was one of the things that we were able to convince a lot of, I'll say, legislators and members of the industry that weren't in the production tier, was that if the things that we're asking for, that we're looking to get out of this bill happen, and every single brewery in the state maxes out, I mean, not just the craft ones, but every brewery, if every one of them maxes out on their locations and their ability to operate as full retail and in direct competition with the taverns and bars and restaurants, it would still constitute less than 3% of the total liquor licenses and on-premise sales in the state of Wisconsin. So, pretty reasonable, really,
Yeah.
then, what we're asking for. And we had that conversation with some of the big decision makers in the legislature. And when we said that, it kind of disarmed this idea that this is going to be apocalyptic for some of the other members of retail. Um, I will say that, you know, as with all good things that happen at political fundraisers that happen on golf courses, we had the opportunity to break bread and have a drink with some of the executives from the Tavern League, and it was the biggest breakthrough that we had had in years. And the biggest thing that happened, and the reason why it happened, was there weren't any lobbyists involved. There weren't any attorneys there. It just happened that their cart was ahead of ours. And damned if we didn't start talking, and damned if we didn't start laughing, and damned if, this wasn't all after having a few beers. And it allows us to create a relationship. And I think that, you know, we've been demonized, they've been demonized. It's that thing where if you guys never sit down, it's hard to know what the other person is.
Mhm.
And I tried to foster, I think, a decent relationship with the leadership of that organization, and was very honest. And I gave my opinion, whether some people liked it or not. I'll say even one of my counterparts on the wholesale side, I called him out of the blue when I thought his lobbyist was being skivy, and the tone of the conversation changed within 24 hours. there's this thing where I think the benefit that we have as the Brewers Guild is that we don't have the money to be as professionally represented. We do have professional representation. We do. We have great lobbyists, but we don't have, an executive director making six figures. We don't have a communications team. We don't have a PAC fund that's got hundreds of thousands of dollars in it. We had to go to those meetings ourselves. And I'll say by ourselves, I'll also mention very specifically Evan Hughes from Central Standard, Ryan Kralwitz from Vines and Threshes Winery. The three of us went to a lot of fundraisers. We talked to a lot of legislators, and we were able to educate and bring up that idea that even if all of these businesses take full advantage of what happens, is it really a threat? No. And what it is, and this is where, depending on who you talk to, is a really good thing, but it's a free market opportunity. It gives us the ability to compete. And if you want, and we had the argument at one point, but if a mom and pop tavern wants to be able to compete with me on a beer that I can sell for $5 that it costs me like a nickel or a dime to make, all you got to do is spend like $3 or $4 million, and if that's your goal, like that's all you got to do, and nobody's stopping you,
Piece of cake, right?
So yeah, like come and compete. Like let's let this be a free exchange of ideas and goods, and just have a free marketplace. And I mean, it's going to work out. It's going to work out for us for sure. And I think anybody else who chooses to compete is going to have the opportunity to succeed. And I think that's what it's all about.
Awesome. Well, thanks for answering that question very, very eloquently and tactfully, I think, as well. So
Yeah.
we're out of time. We're staring at Badger Beer hour and a half here, easy. Probably Badger Beer 2 hours. So thanks for coming on the show, and best of luck going forward. And we'll stay in touch about implementation and how that's all going. Maybe we'll circle back next year. Okay.
Cheers. You bet.
All right.